public hangings. Give me a hot dog, beer, public hangings. The big music, pop beer, public hangings. Holy hope, public hangings. Somebody get a rope and dog.
All right, my friends, welcome to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm sorry I'm late. I had to stop by the Wax Museum to flip off FDR. Apologize to my guests and to my listeners. First of all, before we really get the show going, I want to say a gigantic thank you a million times over to all the people who donated to the show in the last week. I raised quite a few $100s there, and I really appreciate the help. And in fact, I should say, as nice as it is to get a helping hand out of financial hot water, what really did it for me was the notes, the messages that people put on their little PayPal slip in the email. People said a lot of really nice things, encouraging me to just keep the show going no matter what and that kind of stuff. And just seeing that many people willing to kick down $50 and $100 to keep the show on the air shows me that people really appreciate what happens here every Saturday. So I want to thank you guys for that very, very much. And anybody else wants to donate to the show, the fund drive ain't over yet. The website is weekendinterviewshow.com, and it won't be hard to find your link. Now, okay, to our first guest, Lieutenant Colonel Kwiatkowski, retired from the United States Air Force. Karen, welcome back to the show.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
It's great to have you on. Sorry so late. Everybody, you can read what Karen writes at LouRockwell.com and at militaryweek.com. And she's also written a 3-article series for the American Conservative and article called The New Pentagon Papers for Salon.com. Especially recommend her archives at Lou Rockwell and at Military Week. And, Karen, the reason you're famous is because you came out just after the war started, just 2 or 3 months after the invasion of Iraq, and started telling secrets, what I don't guess classified information, but stuff that most people weren't supposed to know about the run-up to the war in Iraq. And you saw what you saw and what you reported to us from the Near East South Asia desk inside the Department of Defense. So can you start us off by telling us exactly what your role was there, what your job was in the U.S. Air Force?
Well, I was a political military analyst, and I had worked in OSD for almost a year and a half when I was moved into Near East South Asia. I was transferred from Sub-Saharan Africa into Near East South Asia, and that was in May of 2002. One of the first things that I noticed and was very surprised at as early as May 2002 is that the war plan for the invasion of Iraq had already been not just drafted, not just requested by the SecDef to CENTCOM and drafted back to the Secretary of Defense, but it had been reviewed once and was on its second review at that time. So in May of 2002, we already knew we were going to go do Iraq. What was left to do and what I saw done was the Pentagon's role, Office of Special Plans role, with their close connection to the Vice President's office. The job left to do was not to plan the war. They already knew they were doing a war. The job left to do was to convince the American people, and what they did to do that was, of course, as we know now, everyone knows, even George Bush has almost admitted as much, basically, twisted facts, took things out of context, made up things, to go ahead and get people excited about this need for an invasion, when in fact there was no need, there was no justification, there was no, there was none of the just war requirements were ever met to go into Iraq. And they knew it, but the job that they were working on in the summer of 2002 and the fall of 2002 was to get the Americans on board. Of course, the way they did that, as we know, weapons of mass destruction, very scary. Mushroom cloud, very scary. Oh, 9/11 linkage, very scary. Okay, none of it was true. They knew it wasn't true, but it was useful to bring Americans on board and to bring the Congress on board that summer and fall. So I saw that, and I was upset by it. I learned what a neoconservative was. I didn't understand neoconservative. I was a Republican, been a libertarian for some time, but I grew up Republican and conservative. I thought, well, conservative, it's the same. But neoconservatism, while it has a pretty big home in the Republican Party, covers both parties, and it has views that are very alien to what traditional Republicans, paleo-conservatives, Barry Goldwater conservatives, it's very different from what we might think conservatism is, very different from what many Republicans grew up believing republicanism was, through fiscal conservatism, non-intervention, small government, decentralization, these kinds of things. And, of course, neoconservative stands for none of those things. And I got to see how they work. Very amazing stuff, very upsetting to me, very much destroyed my the last shreds of belief in the system that I had after, the 19th year of my 20 in the military.
Interesting you talk about the war plans had already been written up. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was up at Camp Casey, and I met a retired master sergeant from Fort Hood from the U.S. Army named Zapp. And he told me that the first week that Bush took office, that they were drawing up the invasion plans, the military plans, from the very week that Bush took office. From the very week,
yes. And that makes sense. And I'll tell you, even from within the Pentagon, I mean, where I worked, I had no inkling, no clue whatsoever that we were going to, quote-unquote, do Iraq. I mean, this was not something, there was no rationale for it. Not only were the sanctions working to the extent that we had designed them to work, there was no threat emanating from Iraq, no military threat. He had no capability to even threaten his neighbors, much less us. And plus, the interesting thing is we were actually buying, or on the receiving end, of most of the oil that he was selling under the Oil for Food program.
Oh, right, but that's when Dick Cheney was in just in private business and didn't own the national government.
Oh, yeah. Yes, exactly.
All right, everybody, we'll be right back with Lieutenant Colonel Karen Kwiatkowski from LouRockwell.com. All right, my friends, welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Scott Horton, and I'm talking with retired Lieutenant Colonel Karen Kwiatkowski of the United States Air Force. We're talking about the Office of Special Plans. If anyone wants to check out some footnotes and learn about the Office of Special Plans, I must recommend you to the writings of Karen Kwiatkowski at LouRockwell.com and at MilitaryWeek.com. Also, Seymour Hersh, Jim Loeb, Robert Dreyfus, Jason Vest, Justin Raimondo, and James Bamford have done lots of great work on the Office of Special Plans. And for those who don't know, Karen, what was the Office of Special Plans? Well,
as I said, I worked in the Near East, South Asia, which is the Middle East policy part of the Office of Secretary of Defense. And in the office that I worked in May of 2002, the summer of 2002, there was no Office of Special Plans other than a couple of guys that people didn't really know about. But through that summer, the summer of 2002, lots and lots of political appointees and people on individual service contracts started to come into our office with no clear job description, and they basically hot desked with us. I mean, it was getting very, very crowded in there. People had desks kind of in between cubicles and that kind of thing, 2 or 3 people in a cubicle and that. So it was getting very crowded, and at some point in late August of 2002, they found new office space upstairs on the 5th floor of the Pentagon. And at that point, it was announced to us that in a staff meeting in late August, that these folks who had come during the summer, that no one knew what they were really doing, would be the Office of Special Plans, and they were going to move out, which we were all happy about. These political appointees and individual contractors, led by a guy named Abe Shulsky, Dr. Shulsky, who had actually been in the Pentagon from the very beginning of the Bush administration, as far as I know. He was in charge of the Office of Special Plans. They all moved up there. And at the staff meeting, they said, it's the Office of Special Plans, but we don't want you to say that. We want you to just call it the Expanded Iraq Desk. So if anyone asks, call it the Expanded Iraq Desk, not the Office of Special Plans. Of course, it was in the newspaper shortly after that, and as the Office of Special Plans. But we were told it was to work only Iraq. And then a few weeks later, after they moved upstairs and had established themselves as a separate office to ostensibly do Iraq planning work, of course, this is before George Bush got his permission from Congress to go whack Iraq. About 3 weeks later, 2 to 3 weeks later, the Iran desk folks, several of those guys, including Larry Franklin, were moved up there with this Expanded Iraq desk. So clearly, it was not just Iraq. It was Iraq and Iran. Larry was a civil servant. There were several other civil servants assigned to the Office of Special Plans, but the bulk of the folks, 20-something folks, the bulk of those folks were contractors and political appointees from various think tanks in Washington. And those think tanks, of course, are American Enterprise Institute, Washington Institute for Near East Affairs, very neoconservative-leaning think tanks, and that was it. That was what they did. Now, once they were established, of course, we breathed a sigh of relief. We now had space in our office, and we didn't have these people wandering around doing nobody knew what, because they weren't really contributing to the normal mission of political mill planning and that kind of thing. They didn't really do that kind of work. It wasn't clear what they did. So we're glad to see them gone. And but we still had contact with them because we were directed through Bill Luty, who was in charge of both offices, above Abe Shulsky and above us. Bill Luty directed us to, in any papers that we prepared after August of 2002, if we had anything to say in these papers about Iraq, about weapons of mass destruction, or about terrorism, we were to write nothing. We were to not go to the intelligence, which we would normally have done. That would be the practice, go to the intelligence, get the latest intelligence, and excise a few blurbs from there to include in our papers. But we were not to do that anymore. We were simply to call Abe Shulsky or his representative in the Office of Special Plans, and they would send to us the precise wording that we would include verbatim in our documentation. And so we did that. And in a sense, I have to tell you, as staff officers, anything that makes our job easier and less work and less time, hey, that's great. So we're happy to do that. Then we were told also, well, at the same time really, that we were never to use these talking points for twice in a row. If you had if you had a paper to turn in Monday, you would get these talking points for that Monday paper. Then if the following week you needed to do a different paper, but you needed to say something about Iraq, WMD, or terrorism, you were required to call up and get the latest version. And this is the interesting part, because if you watched how these things evolved, these talking points, you could see what it was that they were responding to. Now, having looked at the intelligence beforehand, our tradition, our practice was to go to the intelligence. We knew what was in the intelligence. So when we compared the very first copy of the talking points, we could see that this was not the same as the intelligence we had been seeing. Bits and pieces were taken and made more alarming than they presented, or that they were provided from the intelligence community. Things that the intelligence community would say, this is unsubstantiated, would appear in the talking points as if it was a confirmed fact wholly endorsed by the intelligence community. Of course, it wasn't. We knew that. I think you could see that. Second off, as these talking points were provided over a period of several weeks and several months, as we're doing papers that come due, as these things evolved, it was very clear what was influencing them. It wasn't new intelligence, better intelligence. It wasn't corrections to previous mistakes that they had made according to the intelligence. What happened was, when the media exposed something that was listed in these talking points as being false, then and only then, after the New York Times would say, oh, actually, this report of so-and-so visiting in Prague with the members of Saddam Hussein's intelligence corps, that actually, the FBI said that didn't happen. This guy who reportedly visited there was actually in Florida at this time. We have pictures. Only after the media exposed these things were we, inside the Pentagon, directed to change our storyline that we're producing for the higher-ups, for guys like Cheney and Wolfowitz. So, very, very strange stuff. Here's a group of people, not professionals as far as I'm concerned, certainly not intelligence people. They had one intelligence guy up there from DIA, and he was on loan from DIA to them. Very junior guy, GS-14, probably the lowest-ranking guy up in that office. Everyone else, no intelligence experience, putting together these things, responding not to the intelligence, but to whatever the media allowed them to get away with. And, of course, as we know from that summer and fall of 2002, the media was pretty much on board with whatever the Pentagon said. So very much a strange operation. And, of course, it would be no problem if this was about base closings, or if this was about how do we train the Army for the next generation. But this is about a war. This is how we're going to war. Through lies, through propaganda, with incompetent people, untrained people, politically minded people with particular agendas not shared with the Americans, not shared with even the rest of the Pentagon. People who, as we know now, said, "Oh, Iraq will be, will export democracy. They'll be throwing flowers." Crazy stuff and crazy people. So anyway, it's very, very disheartening. from the inside to see this. And I have to tell you, and I've said this before, but lots of guys that I worked with, colonels and Navy captains, these folks who were my peers, they felt much as I did. Very, very upsetting to them what they saw happening, but we felt like there was nothing we could do about it.
Right, they just don't have as much guts as you do.
Well, I don't, I mean, everybody thinks they're a little cog, in the system, and most people, I was intending to leave at some point. This only made me accelerate it. A lot of people didn't intend to leave. They wanted that one last promotion or one more tour, that kind of thing. And they know it was very clear that if you contradicted Rumsfeld, I mean, everyone saw what happened to Shinseki. Anyone at the senior level and any officers that said things that were contradictory to our civilian leadership, or even suggested maybe that, hey, this intelligence, the so-called intelligence you're putting in your talking points really isn't substantiated. This would be enough to cause problems in people's careers. A lot of folks that I know, and what they did, professional civilians that I worked with, and also military guys, accelerated their removal, transferred to another base, found another job, and left before their time was up. Didn't retire from the system, but got themselves out of that particular very deadly environment of lies, basically. And in a sense, I did that too. I retired and started, talking about it a little bit more.
Well, and you had already been talking about it while you still worked at the Pentagon.
I did. Colonel Hackworth, David Hackworth, who passed away, I guess, in June, I think it was, or May. Mm-hmm. What a loss to this nation. I mean, he loved soldiers. He cared about the soldiers. He cared about the truth. He wasn't afraid of anything. And I sent him several essays that I had been writing, and these essays had some humor in them. They were kind of dark humor. It was kind of like my own way of dealing with some of the strangeness I was seeing around me. Very strange stuff. I mean, I really couldn't wrap my head around some of this stuff. It was unbelievable to me. Lies being presented as if they were true. Just, we're in the military. We take an oath. This is very strange to me. I was frustrated. I wrote these articles, and I sent them to David Hackworth, and I said, I cannot put my name on them. If I do, I'm going to get in bad trouble. And he agreed to publish these things anonymously for me, and he did. He did publish those until I left the Pentagon.
I'm very curious. You mentioned Shinseki there. For people who don't know, he's the guy who said he told the Senate that it would take, at least 250,000 troops or something, and then he was sort of forced into an early retirement after that. When you describe this upstairs office full of egghead political appointees with no military experience, no intelligence experience, and they're the ones coming up with basically talking points to justify war. I'm curious about the relationship between the Office of Special Plans and career military people, say on a higher level than you, people who run the Defense Intelligence Agency, for example, or high-level analysts in the CIA. How did they work together?
Well, they didn't really work together. There was a huge amount of tension. In fact, Bill Ludi, given his grade of being the head of the Near East South Asia office over OSP and the rest of us, he was authorized and assigned a senior executive service intelligence professional with a staff, specifically on Mideast intelligence. And this group of 7 or so people, led by an SES-1, which is a star rank, a flag rank of civilians, was assigned to him to be at his complete disposal for any intelligence that he needed, any and all intelligence. If he had a request, hey, find this out for me, whatever. These guys wouldn't even talk to each other. Basically, it was the relationship had already disintegrated to almost not talking to each other by the summer of 2002. And the only reason I really know this, because I knew Bill Ludi and I knew Hardcastle, Mr. Hardcastle, who was the SDS here. The only reason I knew they didn't talk to each other is because I had to arrange a trip where both Ludi and Hardcastle were supposed to attend. We were supposed to travel and go, and they would have to participate in briefings. And I was told, basically, as I blindly progressed on with this planning, I said, this is a standard thing. I was told, this isn't going to happen. One of these guys is not going to go on your trip. And as it turned out, Ludi did not go on the trip, and Hardcastle did. But they wouldn't go, and they would not even talk to each other. So there's your one example of the relationship between DIA at the high levels and Ludi, Bill Ludi, of course, for NISA, and the Office of Special Plans. Where they were getting their intelligence is not clear. Certainly they were going back to older intelligence that had never been substantiated and using it as if it had been. Certainly there was contact with Ahmed Chalabi. I saw Ahmed Chalabi in the office. Okay, he's a very good friend of these people, and certainly he was a source, he and his folks were a source of quite a bit of information that was being posed as hard intelligence, which of course it wasn't. So they were amateurs relying on even more amateurs to produce national policy, and it's not a national policy of, do we spend $1 billion or $1.2 billion? No, this is national policy to go kill people, and lots of them, 2,000 of our guys already. And not to mention, we don't even know the number of Iraqis. We don't know and we don't care how many Iraqis we've killed.
We don't do body
simply
counts.
Irrelevant. That's right. We could care less. And, it's one thing if you did this because it was necessitated by the security of your country, the security needs of your country. If you did this based on very solid evidence, this is a preemptive war that requires the very best intelligence, better than you would ever accept for anything else. This is, for preemptive war, you've got to have the rock-solid truth.
Sure, and if we remember back to 2002, the whole story was nobody on Earth believes that there's weapons of mass destruction there, but George Bush says that he has secret evidence and stuff that we don't know about. So they went from the best intelligence on Earth, and you just have to trust us because we know secret things we can't tell you, to, we were the victims of bad intelligence. How did that happen?
Oh, yeah, they really, Tenet served him admirably. Gave him everything they want, and then, of course, he got his little, Medal of Freedom.
Yeah.
And that really takes the meaning out of the word freedom. George Bush is exporting freedom to Iraq. I mean, they live in martial law. They've been under martial law since their election. Okay, freedom, I'm sorry. And then Tenet gets the Freedom Medal. So what does that mean? We might as well get a new word for it, because it sure doesn't mean what we used to think it meant.
You talk in your American Conservative articles about the Office of Special Plans absolutely disparaging people, high-level, powerful people in the Republican Party and in the military who they consider to be traitors. Colin Powell, the Secretary of State, General Zinni, and you also mentioned Brent Scowcroft and Barry McCaffrey as being subjects of their ire as well.
Oh, yeah. The only loyalty was, if you were, the only patriotism really would be loyalty to the neoconservative party line on the Middle East. Period. If you didn't agree with their party line, their fantasies, okay, and quite frankly, 2.5 years after Iraq, we realized that everything the neoconservatives, planners, advisors, political appointees gave to the American people, gave to the president, foisted on the rest of the world, everything that they said was sheer fantasy. Okay, we know that now. Well, at the time, a lot of people who had looked at the intelligence knew it was fantasy even then. But if you didn't hang on to that fantasy, if you didn't embrace the fantasy, then you were a traitor. And that has nothing to do with being a good American. It has to do with being a good fascist, I guess, if you want to follow blindly your leader, your great leader, I should say. But that was the view. And so guys like, very well-respected General Zinni, who suggested perhaps that they didn't have all their, in November of 2002, he said, you know what, I think the place you're going is not where you want to go based on the facts. And this guy, Zinni, of course, it was Tommy Frank's predecessor. He knew the Middle East very well. Close relationships with lots of the major leaders over there, lots of good intel.
He was the sink all through the 90s, right?
Absolutely. A wonderful guy. I mean, I don't know him personally, but certainly he's well loved by his folks in Central Command. I know that. But in any case, he spoke not meanly, not dangerously, but he simply suggested they ought to rethink some of this stuff, and for that he was labeled, at least in our office, as a traitor. General Zinni's a traitor. I heard Bill Luty call him that, and they wanted Colin Powell. I've talked to other guys that were political appointees. Colin Powell disparaged terribly in the fall of 2002 because he was the one member of the policymakers who kind of forced Bush to go back to the UN one more time.
Right, they hated him for dragging his feet.
Sure, and boy, they hated him for that.
Wow, and here I hated him for capitulating to them. That's funny. All right, everybody, we're talking with Lieutenant Colonel Karen Kwiatkowski of the U.S. Air Force. Check her out at militaryweek.com. We'll be right back. Scott Horton, and I'm talking with Karen Kwiatkowski. Karen, I have to wonder, how did a cool lady like you ever work for the DOD?
Say again?
How did you ever end up working for the DOD in the first place?
I was a highly valued employee of the Pentagon.
I guess the contrast is just...
Yeah. Well, you know, I'd worked there in the air staff, and, you know, I liked what I did, and they liked what I did, too, so they got me up there. Certainly, if they'd known what they know now, I would never have been invited over into Near East South Asia, that's for sure. And, of course, I did not volunteer to go there. They drafted me, which is, you know, kind of funny.
They're going to regret that day. Already do, I'm sure. Now, okay, one of the most intriguing things about your story, and we're almost out of time, but I want to know about the time that you escorted some Israeli generals to Douglas Fife's office. Yeah,
I was a friend of mine at work. We're sitting at our desk, and we got a short notice call by the actual Israeli desk officer, a civilian political appointee, who could not go do this job. He had something else to do, and he said, "Hey, I got 6 guys, Israelis down at the front desk or wherever, the river entrance of the Pentagon. Can you go down there and bring these guys up to Fife's office?" And so, of course, we stopped what we were doing and went down there as quick as we could. And the escort policies had changed after 9/11, and you had to have 1 escort officer for every 3 people. So there were 6 of these guys that required 2 of us. And you had to keep tabs on, you had to stay with your group, et cetera, et cetera. It's much stricter than it had been before. So we got down there, and they apparently had been waiting for a while. They were very impatient. And they took off. As soon as we were there, they just took off through the entryway. And we were walking so fast we almost had to jog to keep up with them. They knew exactly where they were going. They went into Fife's office. We're trailing behind them 10 or 15 feet trying to catch up still. And, you know, the Pentagon is not a place that people who have never been there, they don't just know exactly where to go. It's kind of hard. But these guys apparently had visited here many times, knew what they were doing. When they got into Fife's front office, they went right to his closed office door, the lead guy pushed his door open and barged in, and the secretary jumped up and pushed him back out and said he's got somebody in there just to give him 5 minutes. And so very much an air of familiarity was communicated by that activity. And then in this dead time, this few minutes that we had to wait, I looked over at the sign-in, the security sign-in book, which we had recently had a security inspection. It was very clear that all outside people from embassies or anywhere else, and these guys were, a couple were from the Israeli embassy, the rest were generals from Israel. And the requirement was everyone had to sign in. I had been signing in my North African ambassadors. And so I saw the open book there, and I said, well, hey, you want to have these guys sign in? I said to the secretary, and she threw up both her hands and waved them at me. Said, oh, no, these guys don't have to sign in, which was, you know, that was kind of offensive to me because we had gone through this, you know, with our guys from Tunisia and Morocco, and we used to not make them sign in, but the new security rules, we had to have them sign in. And, you know, it's embarrassing to explain, hey, you know, I know we know you, but we got to have you sign in. But for the Israelis, no, I guess it's a different relationship. But anyway, this is what happened. It's just I'm an eyewitness to a tiny segment of an activity, which for the Israelis and for Doug Fife apparently was very routine. What does that say? You know, you draw your own conclusions. They work very closely together. Well, that's all I can say. I've read Julian Borger's piece in the article in the Guardian, and I've got an idea what that implies. In fact, Philip Giraldi, former CIA official, will be on next to talk a little bit about that. And I'm sorry, there's so much more I wanted to get to here. I wanted to ask you about Larry Franklin, but yes. I do real quickly want to share with you this quote, although I won't have time really for a comment probably. But the Army Times today talking about the looters in New Orleans, in this quote, it says, while some fight the insurgency in the city, others carry on with the rescue. So there you go. The looters in New Orleans are the insurgency, according to the Army Times today. Isn't that something? How do you like that? Thank you so much for your time today, Karen. Okay, well, thanks for having me. I'm really sorry about being late. I'm going to try to have you on again and finish this interview up where we left off. Sure, anytime. Okay, thank you so much. All right, everybody, we'll be right back with Philip Giraldi. Stay tuned.